On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this session on the critical topics of COVID-19 and climate change action. I am delighted to be here with women leaders who will bring their perspective on climate change as a catalyst for a sustainable recovery. Women's equal participation and leadership in political and public life are essential to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. However, data shows that women are underrepresented at all levels of decision-making worldwide, and achieving gender parity in political life is nowhere near the ideal scenario. Investing in women and girls creates ripple effects throughout entire communities and countries. Research shows that countries with high representation of women in parliament are more likely to ratify international environment treaties. Investing in women has great returns. In the agricultural sector, for example, women comprise approximately 43% of the labor force in developing countries. And when provided with the same access to resources as men, women can increase their agricultural yields by 20 to 30%. Not only stepping up total agricultural output in these countries by 2.5 to 4%, but also contributing to world hunger reduction by 12 or 17%, according to the United Nations. This can positively impact climate adaptation in two ways. Appropriate technology or resources contribute to more sustainable farming and conservation, and a reduction in poverty improves people's lives and enables them to better adapt to changes in climate. As women are often in the front line of climate change impacts, empowering women is key to strengthening and building more climate resilient communities. Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the most gender unequal regions in the world, and the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and even widened those gaps. Overcoming the pandemic and its consequences will require all of our efforts, and tackling the gender gap is key. In this sense, our Vision 2025 Reinvest in the Americas plan prioritizes 5 opportunities for the IDB Group to work with the region, including regional integration and strengthening value chains, support for small and medium-sized firms in order to narrow the estimated $1 trillion financing gap, the promotion of a digital economy, and the prioritization of both gender inclusion and climate change responses. In fact, cross-cutting issues of gender equality and diversity and climate change are cornerstones of Vision 2025. The IDB Group has a unique expertise to enhance opportunities for innovative financing, and we welcome the possibility to hear how our panelists share this common vision. Today's conversations will therefore focus on the insights that my fellow panelists can provide from a variety of perspectives on how the pandemic has offered them a unique window to enhance their climate agenda in spite of the terrible consequences of the pandemic. So let's start with our dialogue. Thank you once again for being here. Let me start with Marcia Cattle, Minister of Economic Affairs and Investment of Barbados. Minister, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. As Barbados faces unprecedented challenges because of COVID-19, the government has underlined the need for resiliency to be the strategy for recovery. Could you share with us this vision and what it entails?
Thanks, Jessica. First, let me say that the focus on climate resilience is extremely connected and cannot be separated from financial resilience. And so one of the things that we've said ahead of COP26 is that we want to see a commitment and we want to see a discussion jointly on issues of climate, debt, vulnerability in small island states, many of which are already susceptible and already experiencing significant sea level rise, drought like Barbados, many of which are already seeing higher temperatures than the global averages. And so for us, the climate resilience conversation and the financial resilience conversation are very closely linked. So what is our strategy for resilience? We've built this into 2 key areas that we've been working on. One is our nationally determined contributions, which are among the most ambitious I think you will see ahead of this upcoming COP. We have a clear strategy for a significant reduction in emissions. And we do that even as we realize that Barbados and other similar small island states are not the contributors to the global levels of emissions. We've also built in a resilience strategy into our flagship development program, which we call Roofs to Reefs. And we call it Roofs to Reefs because we realize that resilience has to start with, and in fact, most affects people at the household level, and especially people who live and experience poverty. So issues like people's capacity to implement nature-based solutions, rainwater harvesting, rooftop renewable energy solutions, and battery storage at the household level. These are the important parts of Roofs to Reefs. But why does it go to reefs? Because it also addresses issues that have to do with the methodologies that are used in the agriculture sector, getting back again to nature-based solutions, One example that we have is making sure that we bring in the extension of ponds and so on in order to mitigate flooding, so that what happens is that some of the runoff that is experienced actually binds to the soil and the sand at the level at the coast before it runs off into the ocean. So these are some very practical things. Barbados is a tourism dependent economy. We saw an over 18% contraction in our GDP based on the reduction in tourism and the international standstill in travel. So in the tourism sector, we've also introduced the Barbados Employment and Sustainable Transformation Program. And what does that do? Not only does it introduce government support to get people back to work in a sector that has effectively closed down, but it also requires those tourism firms to implement green solutions as part of their recovery. This is a moment, now that the world has paused, to be able to introduce resilience in everything that we do. And we've taken advantage of this moment of recovery to do just that. The last thing I want to say on this has to do with our doing business agenda, which one might not think is a place to introduce resilience solutions. Now, in 2018, we introduced new planning legislation, new physical planning legislation. And one of the things we did there was to require that certain kinds of developments have to contribute to the balance of natural development by things that we call planning obligations. And so these are some of the ways that you will see Barbados's resilient strategy for growth and inclusive growth across a range of sectors.
Thank you, Minister Cattle. And I appreciate your responses. And I think the way that you broached the issue of resilience as actually its own cross-cutting issue is exactly how we need to talk about these issues. I think people talk about adaptation, mitigation, and resilience in their own buckets, but it's really all of them combined that equal a formula that needs to be looked at and designed appropriately for every country that needs it. Now, let us go to Abigail Demopoulos, Senior Coordinator, International Affairs Climate Task Force in the United States.
Hi, Jessica. How are you? I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have another question here. As Barbados and the minister has proposed a fundamental change in how economies should prioritize their investments, we have seen that the new administration has launched a major policy shift on climate issues domestically and internationally. How do you envision next steps and collaboration among countries on this topic? Go ahead.
Yes, indeed. It's been quite a busy few months at the Treasury Department because the Biden administration, in addition to all of the work that they've been doing on COVID response, launched a very ambitious climate agenda right after the president's inauguration. He released an executive order on January 27th entitled Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. And that gave all of the agencies like the Treasury who work on international issues a mandate and a lot of tasks in order to think through how the US should be re-engaging on climate issues internationally. In April, as I'm sure everyone knows, the president convened the Climate Leaders Summit, where he announced the US nationally determined contribution. He also announced a climate finance plan, which included a pledge to double US public climate finance and to triple adaptation finance. That was something that was a collaborative effort between the department that I work at Treasury, the State Department, and many other US government agencies. At Treasury, we are thrilled to be under the leadership of Secretary Yellen, who is someone who cares deeply about climate change, and as you all know, is the first woman Secretary of the Treasury. Under her leadership, since January, we've really engaged in a lot of fora that we had not been active in before. For example, we joined the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. And we've been very active on climate issues in both the G7 and the G20 international channels, including assuming responsibility for the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which is covering a broad array of topics related to integrating climate in financial decision-making. Some of that relates to issues related to financial sector supervision, but also the types of disclosure that companies use, publicly traded companies use. We've also been looking at some issues in that group related to the MDBs. And Treasury, as part of the executive order, was tasked with coming up with a strategy for integrating climate into all areas of our international engagement. So we're working on pulling that together. And obviously, climate is coming up in many multilateral channels, as I mentioned, the G7 and the G20, in our engagements with the IMF and other multilateral institutions like the IDB. But in addition to that, we, as a government, have launched a number of bilateral dialogues with countries around the world, including in the Latin American and Caribbean region. And I just want to underscore that we are doing all of this work on climate while being mindful of the need to recover from the pandemic, and trying to think about climate in, as Jessica mentioned, an integrated way with gender and diversity issues. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, thank you so much for your response. And it's really great to know how much is going on at the same time. And I know a lot of people are putting a key focus on the next meeting of the COP26. I know we are internally at the IDB. And I think this could not be a more timely discussion to talk about what everyone is doing to see how we can better align our efforts. So thank you so much for the description and all of the good work that's being done. Next is Yolanda Cacabatze, former president of the World Wildlife Fund International. Thank you for being with us. Yolanda, it's a pleasure. You have such an impressive career in climate change action. Thank you. As a person of Ecuadorian descent, I want to tell you that you are a role model for so many women and girls. As a former president of the World Wildlife Fund International and the World Conservation Union, based on your unique experience, what are the lessons learned that we have to include in a sustainable recovery from a biodiversity standpoint?
Thank you, Jessica. Many lessons, I think, several at least. And maybe the most important one to start with is that you cannot separate biodiversity, the biodiversity agenda, from the climate change one. I think that one of the mistakes that we have done in the last couple of decades is to think that one can manage the two separately. And of course, when we look at climate change and the threats of climate change today, we know that they are due to the destruction of ecosystems around the world. And that cannot continue to happen. And what we have seen during this year, this terrible year of COVID, is that people suddenly started to realize that going out into natural systems was safer than staying at home. And staying at home means staying in urban places where the threats were many. And the threats are real. We cannot have healthy human beings in an unhealthy planet. And mainly urban areas, what show is that they are terribly unhealthy in terms of air pollution, in terms of water pollution, in terms of the reduction of space for quality of life. And meaning when we say that people have preferred going out into natural spaces, means that we have to look also into those protected areas that we have created around the world as the havens for biodiversity wealth. We are not investing enough around the world in protected areas. We have taken them for granted or believed them to be areas for the people who care about nature. And that is not so. The protected areas are a protection, a vest in which we wrap security. And security in every sense, security, health security, food security, water security, energy security, all of those depend on a balanced planet where nature is given the right to exist, the right to be permanent, the right to be a wealth that we reach out to when needed. Another lesson that we learned is that people started to look, where do I get food, especially in continents like Latin America and South America? Where does food come from? If I cannot go safely into the traditional markets, can I go into the local ones? And the local ones, relevance, importance started to reach us in the urban areas. And we started to value local family farmers much more than we did before. And that, I think, has been one of the connections that has given us food for thought, because they were not in our immediate circle as before. And if the theory about the origin of this virus is proven to be right, that it came from some animal or not, it doesn't really matter. But what matters is that nature can also be the source of other viruses that are there, hidden at the moment, but ready to jump out if we continue to destroy ecosystems. So some important points, Jessica, that we need to think about. Over.
Sharing, and actually, I think my big takeaway is not only that biodiversity encompasses a lot more than maybe we actually think by its technical definition, but the fact that you're absolutely right. We cannot be healthy societies in an unhealthy world, and I love that, because I think that that's what we leave for the next generation. We need to focus on how to make things better so that every generation improves upon the foundation that hopefully we're establishing now, especially in a new world post-COVID.
That's
so
right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Now, let's go to Jody Mather-Phillip, Director of the Implementation and Support Division at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, COP15 will take place this year with a key momentum to advance the biodiversity agenda. What milestones are crucial for the agenda to ensure ownership at the international level?
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting us to this panel, for inviting the CBD Secretariat to contribute to this discussion. And let me begin by offering my sincere thanks to the IDB Group and its Climate Change Division for convening this extremely impressive panel. A lot of the people on the panel are my heroes, as you said too. And so I am so pleased to be part of it. I also would like to thank Ms. Kakabati for bringing biodiversity squarely into the debate on climate change. But to your question, this year is indeed a very, very important year for us. It will be the landmark year for nature, and with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework set to be adopted at the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15 in Kunming in China, which we're hoping will be later this year. The new framework will be a companion to the Paris Climate Agreement, and it will focus specifically on nature. It will include 30-year goals, 10-year targets, and also policy directions to guide our global society over the next 3 decades. The impacts of COVID-19, as has already been said, have brought the importance of biodiversity conservation more clearly into focus and highlighted the need to enhance the mainstreaming of biodiversity and ecosystem services into sectors such as health, agriculture, fisheries, forestries, and climate change, as well as into planning and development policies and processes. And as you said, the impacts on women have been devastating, as all reports are showing, and therefore empowering women is indeed very important. In fact, I would say essential for building back better from this pandemic and also for the future of our global biodiversity framework. During the past year and into 2021, we have seen an unprecedented mobilization of critical partners, which are so important for our agenda, beyond governments and significant commitments by the business sector and finance, as well as by subnational and local governments. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will not only set our global goals and targets, it will also address the means of implementation and provide an enhanced monitoring and accountability framework, which is also something that is extremely important for the framework. There will be targets apropos this discussion for both mitigation in terms of halting biodiversity loss, but also for emissions reduction, as well as for ecosystem approaches to climate change, including safeguards for biodiversity to stop loss, hopefully future pandemics, but also to support the One Health initiative. As we all know, biodiversity is 37% of the solution for climate change, but also that climate change is one of the 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, as was reported by the IPBES Global Assessment in 2019. Also, health and future pandemics are intimately linked to the health of biodiversity and how we as humans treat nature. And this has already been said by Ms. Kakabadji earlier, just before me. A UN report estimates that all future pandemics will likely be through zoonotic sources. Additionally, implementation of the new framework will require an unprecedented mobilization of financial resources from all sources, as well as the development of capacities at all levels and the mainstreaming of biodiversity in all economic sectors. Thus, this in turn requires the involvement of all public and private actors to increase their ambitions on nature and signal early action that is commensurate with the 2050 vision. The world will accept nothing less than a transformative global framework on biodiversity, one that will mark the beginning of a new era for the protection of nature. This year, we must restore hope for people, planet, and prosperity, and put us on a path to our vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. We need to recalibrate the conservation goals in our economic thinking, redesign incentives and policies, and help set our world on a path to ecological and social sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jody. And we all have very ambitious goals, and I'm really excited to see as this agenda develops where we are by the end of the year. We at the IDB are trying to be equally as ambitious, if not more so, than we have been in the past, because we are aware of the urgency of addressing all of these issues. So thank you again. Now, Maria Alexandra Moreira Lopez, the Secretary General of the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, is here with us. So we're going to pivot to you. The Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization is an intergovernmental organization. What do you think is the catalytic role of natural capital to promote collaboration and recovery in a post-COVID-19 world?
Thank you, Jessica. First of all, I want to congratulate you for organizing this important event and for your leadership at the bank and for your growing interest in the Amazon. Regarding your important question, the role played by the largest basin in the world and the ecosystem with the greatest biological diversity is fundamental in our Amazon country, and why not to say in the entire world. The Amazon occupies 44% of the territory of Latin America, so it is unthinkable not to consider it in a scenario of recovery and reactivation, not only economically, but social and environmentally too. It is important to remember that the COVID-19 pandemic arrived at the time when there was already evidence of growing imbalances that indicate that the prevailing patterns of production, distribution, and consumption were not sustainable. As the CLAD highlights, we were going through 3 major crises. The first one, the slower and more unstable growth of world product and trade. The rapid increase in inequality in the world's major economies, and the third one, the environmental destruction and climate change. This whole situation has forced us to rethink the great role of the regional cooperation and articulate work among Amazon countries in order to develop more pragmatic actions. The 8 member countries of the Amazon Cooperative Treaty Organization approved this last May 21 our biodiversity program for the Amazon region, which constitutes an historic milestone because this program brings together for the first time the common vision of the Amazon countries to improve the management of biological diversity and the protection of traditional knowledge, for example, of indigenous people and local communities through collaborative and cooperative actions in the short, medium, and long term to achieve the objectives of the CBD and the goals of the 2030 Agenda. The countries recognize the potential of the biological diversity present in the Amazon as an opportunity for sustainable development, focused on reducing inequality gaps in income, health, and education, among others, promoting sustainable employment, environmentally responsible practice of the population, and the recovery of ecosystems and species under threat or under pressure for the international commerce. We seek to work on a transformative recovery, increasing public and private investment, aiming at a path with low carbon emission and less depend of the destruction of natural resources, which has an essential elements, the productive transformation and technological development with innovation, promoting national, regional, and international competitiveness, while redefining the investment incentive system in favor of equality and sustainability. One of the essential issues is the promotion of equality, which helps to sustain income and aggregate demand to encourage more productive growth when associated with the wide access to education, health, and opportunity for all people, particularly women. Today, there is a growing consensus that inequality is the enemy of the productivity, learning, and innovation. Those elements are aimed at strengthening ACTO's actions, also strengthening our voice as an Amazon region and contributing to the integration processes. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much for your insights, and actually thank you all for this initial start of the discussion. I think we've touched on a lot of critical issues. I will say that for us at the IDB, we're working on our Amazon Fund and dealing with those communities in these areas as part and parcel of what we're hoping to be able to do to build those bridges and to make this a more inclusive process. So thank you all already. Now we're shifting to a second round of questions. Before we start, I wanted to ask each of our panelists if you could please keep your responses as concise as possible. We're trying to stay within time limits so that our audience can keep moving to the second panel because we have quite an ambitious agenda for the day. So Minister Cattle, back to you. Biodiversity is a key driver for panelists, all of you here today. How does Barbados value nature capital? How does your ministry prioritize nature-based solutions?
Thanks, Jessica. It's interesting to be asked as a minister from a small island about the question of how we value natural capital. We, as an island, are all natural capital. I think there are two things I would want to say here. One, for us as we go into COP, the question is, how does the world value the natural capital of small, vulnerable islands? I mean, that is really the question that we're seeking to answer at this next very important meeting. One of the things that we've been saying is that we definitely need to see, Yolanda was saying that the biodiversity conversation has to be happening alongside the climate conversation, which has to be happening alongside the means of implementation conversation. How are we addressing adaptation? How are we investing more in adaptation, including investments in nature-based solutions for small islands that are seeing more quickly the impacts of these emissions and of climate change? Now, in Barbados, we have programs where, for example, we take a risk-based approach to make sure that we are able to assign a value to our reefs and to our coastal infrastructure so that we have a good sense of if these are impacted in natural disaster, what is the level of investment that is required. What we've done in our NDCs is we've taken an approach of essentially rating our projects under the Roofs to Reefs program to see what has a certain biodiversity value, which ones have a certain investment return for private investors. And these things are important. But what is extremely important is for the world to increase investment in adaptation funding. At the moment, it stands at 20%. This is one of the things that is very important if internationally we are valuing the natural capital of small islands. The final thing I'll say is that, and this may be a bit controversial, one of the things COVID has taught us with respect to the care economy is that that economy, care, and how people's inputs have been able to help us recover has been central to the recovery. Nature and the environment have been and continue to be central to the recovery. But we continue to want to assign a certain kind of value. As an economist, this might sound strange for me to say, but once we do understand the market-based value, then what? I think it's important to understand the market-based value, but I think it's also important to understand that there is another kind of value, the value that keeps our societies together, the value that keeps people well. It is important to make this visible in terms of GDP, but it's also important to understand that in many ways, it's not just about the market-based value. It's about the fact that these are the inputs, nature and people and their work and their creative energy that helps the world survive. And this is a conversation that we also need to have.
Thank you, Minister. And I actually don't think that statement is controversial at all. I welcome it because a lot of the discussions that we're having internally here is, no one's talking as much as now, I guess, about climate change and resilience and adaptation and mitigation and the value of nature. But I agree with you, placing a quantitative value on it isn't the goal here. The goal is what are the returns? And the returns aren't bottom line revenue streams all the time. It's also about the contributions to society. And I think, if anything, I hope that a lesson all of us have learned about COVID is that we need to build the threads and strengthen the threads that tie us all together in society, and especially in our region, because we're very vulnerable to a lot of many issues, pressing issues, gender, climate, two of just many. And we need to think about it as a coherent solution that, again, is generational, that we can pass on from one generation to the next. So thank you, Minister, for your thoughtful comments. Turning back to Abigail, what does U.S. Treasury view as priorities for climate finance to meet the pressing challenge of climate change in Latin America and beyond?
Thanks for that question, Jessica. So I think this year our most important priority is to re-engage both multilaterally and bilaterally to ensure that institutions like the IDB are doing as much as possible to integrate climate and other broader sustainability goals into their lending and policy advice to countries as everyone works to recover from the pandemic. At the moment, we're particularly focused on promoting the alignment of MDB operations with the Paris Agreement, and also enhancing MDB support for countries seeking to bolster their nationally determined contributions. And we're also working to seek more ambitious climate finance commitments from the MDBs, particularly IDB and the private sector windows of the banks as well, because we really feel that it's critical to bolster the mobilization of private finance with each dollar of MDB finance, especially in areas like adaptation, where traditionally there's been a stronger focus on public sector stuff and less work on the private sector. As part of this agenda, securing robust replenishments of the MDB concessional windows, particularly the World Bank IDA, replenishment is a very high priority, as these replenishments are critical to making resources available quickly to help support climate investments in the poorest countries. Obviously, given the vulnerability to many parts of the LAC region to natural disasters, and also consistent with the president's plan to increase focus on adaptation financing, we are looking into options to be more involved in regional disaster risk insurance pools, and so we're exploring those options. Some of that we subject to availability of funds, and noting my colleagues' comments about natural capital and biodiversity, the executive order that I mentioned earlier has a specific provision related to protection of the Amazon and global carbon sinks. So Treasury is working with several agencies to explore work in this area, and we're very pleased to see the IDB launch its Amazon initiative earlier this year. in closing, I'll say a core priority is really to encourage MDBs like IDB and IDB Invest to work to increase the engagement of the private sector on climate and sustainability issues. We do think that IDB can play a critical role in attracting FDI into the region and in helping local investors to enter new sectors. I know there's been a tremendous amount of creative work by IDB Lab and by the Natural Capital Lab to think about ways to promote new models for financing of climate and sustainability, and we'd like to see some of those scaled up more. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Abigail. We'd like to see them scaled up more too, so we're at least on the same page on that and on working with our MDB partners here in Washington and overseas. I think we're working on that roadmap, and I know we look forward to having more conversations with you and with Treasury to see how we can do exactly what you laid out, scale up and have more impact and bring in more private sector investment. We also see that as a huge boon for the region if done right. So now let's pivot to Yolanda. As the region still faces COVID-19 challenges, how do you think this crisis has had an impact on how we perceive biodiversity and how we need to act? You might be on mute.
Thank you. I would like to mention something that the previous panelists have already highlighted in the importance of biodiversity, but focusing on food. I think that something very special in LAC is solidarity. And what we have seen during this year and a half is that the poorer have been in more difficult situation, the most vulnerable have been desperate, while others have had the benefit of keeping well. And one of the reasons for that is that food has been in a collapse, reaching with food to the poorer and the most vulnerable, not the production itself. But we have all seen how the hospitality sector has collapsed. We have seen how difficult it has been for many to reach places where food has been marketed. And that has reverted into the growth and strengthening of food banks, for example, into the growth and strengthening of the food agenda, which by coincidence has been working together with the organization of the Food Systems Summit that will take place later on this year. And the two groups and the dialogue between those in need and those who can has been fertilized by the threat and by the impact of COVID on the food market. It is important, for example, to acknowledge that if food loss and waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter of gases. China, the US, and food loss and waste. And that has led many of us working on the food agenda to react in favor of connecting biodiversity and food diversity with the climate change threats. And that needs to grow all over. Then we need to work much more on the awareness of how important it is to produce food, to consume food, and all the change, but with responsibility, taking care of how relevant it is to be responsible on consumption and avoid food loss and waste. Over.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate those comments. I want to say the issue of food is something that we're starting to talk about a lot more. Food insecurity, what does this mean for the access to smaller businesses that are food markets, and the impact on the tourism industry if they don't have access to the small providers that they used to have before. What does that mean? The ripple effects are massive. And we just spent a week in Miami, and we spoke with some members of the tourism industry in the region, and they talked a lot about these supply chain issues of how you get access to food, how do people who want to go enjoy and spend, which is investment in these countries, do that if they don't have anywhere to go. Food insecurity as well is a key development issue that we're looking at in terms of how it relates to climate change as well. So thank you so much for your remarks. Pivoting again to Jody on Kunming and the delivery of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. What are those next steps?
So first of all, we had just 2 weeks ago, just over 2 weeks ago, we concluded 6 weeks of virtual sessions of our subsidiary bodies, which are a critical stepping stone to our road to Kunming. This is the first time that delegates actually did take part in formal negotiations, which is not something that we have done in the past. And they were quite successful. And we advanced our work towards the Global Biodiversity Framework and the advice that the subsidiary bodies were supposed to provide to the co-chairs of the working group on post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And as we speak, the co-chairs and us are busily revising the key elements of the previous version of the framework to reflect this advice and inputs from the subsidiary bodies. We are revising provisions such as the 4 long-term goals related to the 2050 vision for biodiversity, the milestones to assess progress, and the action-oriented targets. We are also looking at updating sections that address the range of implementation support mechanisms and enabling conditions required for implementation. This first draft is expected to be released in all 6 languages, all 6 UN languages in the next 2 weeks. And we invite you to have a look at it as the first session of the open-ended working group, which will start negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework, will begin on 23rd of August for 2 weeks and will end just in time for the start of the World Conservation Congress. In the broader context, the co-chairs will be working to ensure the coherence and complementarity of this framework with other international processes, all of them that we have discussed today, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement, and other processes, framework strategies. Finally, we should remember that the eyes of the world are upon us, and they are demanding a new era for the protection of nature, as has been discussed today. I'm fully confident that delegates to the CBD will launch this new era by adopting a transformational and ambitious global framework, which you will help us implement. And this will truly transform the global economic system and help us attain our 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. And I think that this was a very timely discussion because some deadlines and timelines are coming up in the calendar. Yes. And as quickly as we discuss them, we'll be meeting them. So thank you for sharing. And now let's turn to Maria Alexandra. The IDB Group, in partnership with the OTCA, launched the Initiative for the Sustainable Development of the Amazon region. The bioeconomy is at the heart of this effort. How do you foresee the implementation of our efforts on the ground and the synergies with ongoing actions?
Well, the biodiversity potential is the main differential of competitiveness in our Amazon countries, and bioeconomy may become an important driver for the integral development of our region. We understand bioeconomy in a holistic way as economy of living in harmony and balance among the people and nature. However, we need to consider that there is the need to adapt this concept to our national and local realities. This concept enables to coordinate 2 apparent conflicts approach: economic growth and ecosystem integrity conservations. through promoting a virtuous process based on the use of innovative biodiversity models, driving an economic model more harmonious with nature, and helping to reduce the Amazon region outstanding socioeconomic inequality. In this context, greater opportunities and mutual benefits for ecosystems and people may result promoting the conservation of forests, water resources, and biodiversity in the others. Additionally, bioeconomy must be developed through interscientific dialogue, combining the high innovation and technology of modern science and with traditional and local knowledge. The implementation of bioeconomy will consider the development of industrialization and transformation of unique products from biodiversity in an equitable and inclusive way, coordinating small, medium, large-scale initiatives and encourage sustainable entrepreneurship. As an economic driver within the local, regional, and international arenas, the bioeconomy will allow us to put aside our country's economic dependence from the primary raw material producing sector that are affecting many of our ecosystems, and particularly our Amazon population. And finally, in most of our countries, the concept of bioeconomy is being discussed right now. I consider that we have to be very careful between the balance of the public and private role when implementing policies and financial instruments that will make possible a suitable environment for this vision to prosper. We are dealing with biological diversity, so we cannot give the wrong impression and we cannot make the mistake of the past believing that the markets and just the business are the only answer to a post-COVID scenario. The tasks and work are much broader. We need models and tools that contribute to social and environmental welfare, and that local economies can be generated and boosted in the Amazon. We greatly appreciate the work that the IDB is doing with our organization and the Amazon countries, trying to develop other more sustainable visions and tools in the region. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, and we look forward to continuing our joint work, and we hope that we have more impact and do so very quickly. Fellow women leaders, this session has been exceptional, and I want to thank you. Thank you for your expertise on such critical topics that have allowed us to gain additional understanding of all the challenges at stake and all the opportunities as we develop the best strategies for the region to avoid losing another decade as we move ahead toward a more sustainable and more resilient recovery. I thank all of you in our audience for your presence and look forward to our continuous collaboration and to seeing your ambitious work implemented in our region. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thanks a lot.